The world was often cold and wet. Rain fell for weeks. It turned fields into mud pits. The seeds rotted in the ground, or a frost came late in the spring. It killed the new green shoots. The sun could be just as cruel. A long drought would bake the earth hard as stone. The wheat would wither on the stalk. The river would shrink to a trickle. For the medieval peasant, life was a gamble against the sky. Their world was the field next to their hut. Their wealth was the grain in their small store. And that store was almost always half empty. Most people today think of medieval feasts. They imagine kings and lords tearing into roasted swans. They see tables groaning with meat and bread and wine. That was a world for 1% of the people. For everyone else, life was a thin gruel. The daily meal was pottage. It was a watery stew of whatever grew. Oats, barley, peas, beans. Maybe a cabbage or an onion if you were lucky. You ate it with a piece of hard dark bread. This bread was made from rye or barley, not soft white wheat. It was gritty. Sometimes it had bits of dirt or chaff baked into it. You dunked it in the pottage to make it soft enough to chew. Meat was a rare thing. A peasant might own a pig. That pig was their savings account. It ate scraps and foraged in the woods. You fattened it all year for the winter slaughter. Every part of it was used. The meat was salted and smoked to last. The fat was rendered for cooking. The intestines were cleaned for sausage casings. The blood was made into pudding. Nothing was wasted. Nothing could be wasted. A chicken was a treasure. Its eggs were more valuable than its meat. A cow was a beast of burden and a source of milk. You only ate it when it was too old to pull a plow, and the meat was tough as leather. This was a good year. In a bad year, there was nothing. The harvest failed. The small store of grain was gone by Christmas. The Lord still demanded his share. The priest still demanded his tithe. The hunger started as a dull ache. Then it became a sharp pain that never went away. People ate the seed grain they were supposed to plant for next year. That was a death sentence for the future. But the future didn't matter when your children were crying from hunger today. They ate the dogs and cats first, then the rats. They stripped the bark from trees and tried to boil it into something edible. They dug up roots and ferns. They ate weeds they would normally pull from the garden. The forest was the Lord's property. Poaching a deer was a hanging offense, but a starving man will risk the rope. Still, there were not enough deer for everyone. The body begins to eat itself. The fat melts away. Then the muscle. The skin hangs loose on the bones. The belly swells up with fluid. It's a cruel trick of starvation. A person can look fat but be dying. Their hair falls out. Their teeth loosen in their gums. Their eyes sink back into their skull. They lose the energy to walk. They just sit in their dark, cold huts. They listen to the wind and the rain. They listen to the silence where a cow used to low or a chicken used to cluck. This is the world we must understand. It is not a world of choice. It is a world of necessity. The question isn't what people wanted to eat. The question is what they could find when the pottage pot was empty and the bread bin was bare. What was left when the dogs were gone and the bark was stripped from the trees? What was left when your own body was consuming itself? You looked at the ground, at the dirt, and you saw things moving, small things, crawling things. And the question changed. It was no longer what is food. It was what can I put in my mouth to stop the pain. To eat an insect was not just a matter of taste. It was a matter of faith and a matter of filth. Medieval society was built on order. Everything had its place. God was in heaven. The king was on his throne. The lord was in his castle. The peasant was in the field. This order extended to the natural world. Some animals were good and noble. The lion, the eagle. Some were useful and clean. The cow, the sheep. And some were base and unclean. They crawled on their bellies in the dirt. They were associated with decay and death. This was the world of insects. The Bible was the ultimate authority. It was the word of God, and the book of Leviticus had very specific rules. It drew a line between clean and unclean animals. It said you could eat certain kinds of locusts, crickets, and grasshoppers, the kind that have jointed legs for hopping on the ground. But it forbade eating any other flying insect that walks on all fours. It called them detestable. The medieval mind did not make fine distinctions between species of beetle or fly. They were all just bugs. Crawling, swarming, unclean things. To eat them was to defy God's law. It was to consume something detestable. Insects were a sign of God's wrath. A plague of locusts was not a natural disaster. It was a punishment from heaven. It descended on a sinful people to devour their crops and leave them with nothing. The locusts in the Bible were an army of God's fury. They were a living tide of destruction. You did not eat the instrument of God's anger. You prayed for it to go away. Flies were associated with the devil himself. One of Satan's names was Beelzebub. It means Lord of the Flies. Flies swarmed around rotting meat and dung. They were born from filth. They carried disease. They were a constant buzzing reminder of corruption and decay. To put a fly in your mouth was to invite the devil inside. It was to consume corruption itself. Maggots were even worse. They were the children of flies. They writhed in dead things. They were the visible proof of putrefaction. The thought of eating them would have been horrifying. It was a kind of cannibalism, eating something that was eating the dead. There was also a social discussion. Peasants worked the soil. They were seen as being close to the dirt. They were considered base and crude by the nobility. Their hands were calloused, their clothes were filthy. Eating things that lived in that same dirt would only confirm their low status. It would be an admission that they were no better than the worms in the soil. It was a deep source of shame. A person of any standing would rather starve than be seen eating a beetle. It was an act of ultimate degradation. It meant you had fallen to the very bottom of the world. So the barriers were immense. They were religious, they were cultural, they were psychological. An insect was not just a potential source of protein. It was a symbol. It was a symbol of divine punishment, demonic influence, and social failure. The crunch of an exoskeleton would not just be an unpleasant sound. It would be the sound of a taboo breaking. It would be the sound of a soul in peril. Even during a famine, these beliefs would hold strong. People would exhaust every other option first. They would eat leather from their shoes. They would eat the straw from their mattress. They would eat dirt and clay, hoping it would fill the emptiness in their stomachs. These things were not forbidden by God. They were not inhabited by the devil. They were just desperate measures. Eating an insect was a step beyond desperation. It was a step into a spiritual darkness. It was an act you would do in secret, in the dark of your own hut. You would pray for forgiveness as you did it. You would feel a profound sense of self-loathing. You were not just trying to survive. You were wrestling with your own damnation. Finding proof is hard. The past is mostly silent. What we have are the words of the literate monks, nobles, and clerks. They wrote about kings and wars. They wrote about saints and miracles. They did not write about what a starving peasant ate in the privacy of his hovel. The daily life of the poor was beneath their notice, unless they died in huge numbers. Then they became a statistic in a famine chronicle. The chronicles are grim reading. They talk of a great hunger in the land. They say things like, the poor did eat dogs, cats, and unclean things. Or people were driven to eat what is not lawful for a man to eat. What were these unclean things? What was not lawful? The writers rarely give details. They were educated men. They were probably disgusted by the very idea. They used vague language to hide the horror, but unclean things would certainly include insects. It was a catch-all term for the forbidden and the foul. We have accounts from the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317. This was a cataclysm. It rained and rained for 2 years. The crops failed everywhere. The price of grain shot up. People starved in the streets of cities and in the fields of the countryside. One chronicler from Ireland wrote that the poor were so destroyed by hunger that they extracted the bodies of the dead from the cemeteries and dug into the flesh and ate it. If people were driven to cannibalism, eating insects seems almost trivial in comparison. It falls under the shadow of that greater taboo, but it was likely a step on the path to that final horror. Before you eat your neighbor, you eat the beetles in your wall. The silence in the written record is not surprising. A peasant couldn't write, and even if he could, he would not record his own shame. It would be a secret he took to his grave. It was an act of survival, not something to be proud of. It would be like admitting you had failed as a human being. So we look to the ground. We look to archaeology, but insects do not leave much behind. A cow bone can last 1,000 years. A pottery shard can last forever, but the exoskeleton of a beetle is fragile. It is made of chitin. It breaks down quickly in the soil. It is almost impossible to find in an archaeological dig. And even if you did find the crushed remains of a beetle in the hearth of a medieval hut, what would it prove? Was it eaten, or was it just a bug that crawled into the fire? There is no way to know for sure. The physical evidence is almost non-existent. We can look for other clues. We can look at what people ate in other desperate times. In sieges. During a siege, a city was cut off. The food ran out slowly. People kept records. They listed the price of a rat, a dog, a horse. They rarely mention insects. Again, this could be because of shame. Or it could be that in a crowded city, there just weren't enough insects to gather to make a meal. It is easier to catch a rat than it is to collect a pound of ants. There is one place we might find a trace. The study of coprolites, fossilized human feces. By analyzing these remains, scientists can see exactly what a person ate. They can find traces of seeds, grains, and even fish bones. In theory, they could find the indigestible parts of insects. But finding a well-preserved coprolite from a specific medieval peasant during a specific famine is incredibly rare. It is like looking for a needle in a continent-sized haystack. The science exists. The samples do not. So we are left with hints and shadows. We have the vague words of the chroniclers. We have the logic of starvation. We know people were pushed to the absolute limit of human endurance. We know they ate things that revolt us today. Cannibalism is the ultimate proof of that. It is the line no one wants to cross. If they cross that line, it is almost certain they cross the smaller, less terrible line of eating insects first. The lack of direct evidence is not proof that it didn't happen. It is proof of the shame and secrecy that surrounded the act. It was a private horror, not a public event. It was whispered about, not recorded. It was a memory that people wanted to forget. While a beetle on the dinner plate was a sign of desperation, a beetle in a bottle could be a sign of healing. The medieval world did not separate food from medicine in the way we do. They believed in a system of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. A healthy person had these four fluids in balance. A sickness was an imbalance. Food and medicine were used to restore that balance. Some things were considered hot and dry. Others were cold and moist. Insects had their place in the system. They were not seen as just pests. They were part of God's creation. And, everything in God's creation had a purpose. Many insects were believed to have powerful medicinal properties. This knowledge was not new. It came from the ancient world. The Romans, especially Pliny the Elder, wrote extensively about using insects in medicine. These texts were copied and studied by monks and physicians throughout the Middle Ages. So, while a peasant might starve before eating a bug, a physician might prescribe one as a cure. The context was everything. One was an act of shame, the other was an act of science, as they understood it. Consider the ant. Ants were thought to be hot and dry. A poultice of crushed ants could be applied to a person suffering from lethargy or a cold, wet ailment like a bad cough. The formic acid in the ants would cause a stinging sensation. This was seen as proof that the remedy was working. It was driving out the cold and stimulating the body. Some remedies called for drinking wine in which ants had been drowned. This was thought to purify the blood. Woodlice, the small gray bugs that roll into a ball, were another common ingredient. They were often called sow bugs or pill bugs. They were prescribed for stomach problems, jaundice, and difficulty urinating. They would be crushed, often while still alive, and mixed with wine or honey. The taste must have been dreadful. But sickness was more dreadful. People would endure the cure to escape the disease. The blister beetle, also known as Spanish fly, was famous. It was a powerful irritant. When dried and powdered, it could be used to create blisters on the skin. This was a common medical practice called vesication. And doctors believed that the blister would draw the bad humors out of the body, curing everything from joint pain to plague sores. The beetle powder was also known as an aphrodisiac, but it was incredibly dangerous. It was a potent poison. A small mistake in the dose could kill a person. Even the humble cockroach had a use. Ground into a powder and mixed with oil, it was used as a salve for earaches. Bed bugs, crushed and mixed with egg, were thought to cure fever. The red cochineal insect, which lives on cacti, was used to create a brilliant red dye. But it was also used in medicine. It was mixed into cordials and given to people suffering from melancholy or heart problems. The bright red color was thought to be a good sign. It looked like healthy blood. This was the crawling pharmacy of the medieval world. It sounds gruesome to us. The idea of crushing living things and applying them to our bodies is repulsive. But it was based on a logical system. It was an attempt to understand and control the world. The properties of an insect were observed. The blister beetle caused blisters. Therefore, it could be used to make medicinal blisters. The logic is direct, if flawed. This use of insects in medicine shows that people were not universally repulsed by them. They were willing to handle them, crush them, and even consume them, but only in a specific context. The insect had to be transformed. It was no longer a bug. It was an ingredient. It was prescribed by an authority, a physician, or a wise woman. It was mixed with other things, like wine or herbs, to disguise its nature. This made it acceptable. It was medicine, not food. It was a cure, not a curse. This distinction was vital. It separated the healer from the starving man. It separated science from shame. Imagine a village in the third year of famine. The silence is the first thing you notice. There are no birds singing. They have been caught and eaten. There is no dog barking. It was eaten last winter, the fields are bare mud, the trees near the village have a strange, pale band around their trunks where the starving have peeled away the bark to boil. The people who are left move slowly. They look like skeletons draped in rags. Their eyes are large and hollow. They do not talk much. There is nothing left to say. Inside a hut, it is dark. The fire is out. There is no fuel. A woman sits on a dirt floor. Her child lies on a straw pallet. The child does not cry anymore. It just makes a small, whimpering sound. The mother has tried everything. She has boiled leather. She has made a soup from nettles and weeds. She has dug for worms. The worms are gone now, too. Her husband went into the woods a week ago. He was looking for anything. A squirrel, a mushroom, a root. He did not come back. He probably fell from weakness and died alone. The hunger is a physical presence in the hut. It is a beast that lives inside her. It claws at her stomach. It makes her head feel light and strange. She looks at her own hands. They are thin and bony. She thinks about eating them. The thought is not as crazy as it should be. Then she hears a sound. A faint scratching and skittering from the wattle and daub walls of her hut. Or beetles. Or maybe cockroaches. In the good times, they were a nuisance. A sign of a dirty house. She would crush them under her heel without a thought. Now, the sound is different. It is the sound of something alive. Something with substance. The shame is the first thing that rises. It is a hot, bitter taste in her mouth. God has forbidden this. The priest has warned against unclean things. Her neighbors, the ones who are still alive, would shun her if they knew. She would be lower than an animal. She closes her eyes. She sees the face of the priest, fat and healthy, from the church's grain stores. She sees the face of the Lord's Reeve, who came last month to take their last pig for taxes. The anger burns away some of the shame. She gets up. Her knees tremble. She moves to the wall. She pries away a piece of loose daub. They spill out. Dark, shiny bodies. They scatter in the dim light. She is clumsy. Her hands are slow, but she catches one. It struggles in her palm. Its legs are sharp and prickly. She can feel its life, a tiny, frantic energy. She hesitates. Her whole life, her whole faith, her whole sense of who she is, screams at her not to do it. Then she hears the whimper from the pallet. She puts the beetle in her mouth. She does not chew. She cannot bear the thought of the crunch. She just swallows. It scratches all the way down. She gags. Tears stream down her face. They are not tears of sadness. They are tears of revulsion. She has broken a fundamental law of her world. She catches another, and another. She works methodically. Her movements become faster, less hesitant. She is no longer thinking about God or the priest or her neighbor. She is thinking only of the small, hard things in her hand, the small packets of life that might give her child another day. She gathers them in a wooden bowl. She takes them to the pallet. She crushes one with a stone. She mixes the paste with a little rainwater. She forces it between the child's lips. This was not a meal. It was an extreme unction. It was the last resort of the damned. Medieval people did eat insects. They did it quietly. They did it secretly. They did it when they had been stripped of everything else. Their crops, their animals, their dignity, their hope. It was not entomophagy as we think of it today, a sustainable food choice. It was a gruesome necessity in a world that was often merciless. It was the final desperate act of a human being who was simply not ready to die. It was the sound of a beetle shell cracking in the dark, the sound of survival, and the sound of a soul being pushed to its very edge.